Welcome to Isn't It Obvious, where things are obvious. That's going to be the intro.
That's going to be the intro forever now.
Right.
Welcome to Isn't It Obvious? Today's topic is presented by me, Micah, for the consideration of Sera and Phil. Isn't it obvious that Martin Luther is one of the biggest bastards in human history?
Whoa, I was
Probably.
not seeing this coming.
Well, it plays into the law of unintended consequences, where he saw that the establishment and the power structure of Europe in the 1400s? What was it, 1390 something that he posted the
Well, that'll be a
95th
show
thesis?
notes thing.
I'm just gonna nod my head and say yes, that sounds about right.
But, he saw a massive corruption in the essential governmental system, and the one that dictated the eternal life of all Europeans. And he saw that when they were selling indulgences, that was going against the word of the Bible, as he was somewhat competent and knew how to
And
read.
it's
So
like,
he then
hey,
translated
everybody, this is
Yeah.
stupid. I'm going to point it out.
But he took the power of God, which at that time was law, and he gave that power to be interpreted by the common man. And, because humans are stupid, they misinterpreted a lot of the laws, and they used a lot of it to justify horrible, horrible action. So,
I believe the whole
because
Protestant Reformation generally started by Martin Luther, but that whole thing was kind of a not a good time in history for humanity, with like all the sieges and new cults cropping up, the Baptists and yep, just a lot of shit going down at that time.
Baptists, and then Anabaptists,
The Anabaptists.
then
yeah.
Anti-Baptists,
Yep, whatever.
which is a different sect, I believe.
Oh, there's so
And
many.
then, hold on, Mormons, because, Jesus
Well,
really
the
came back to
Mormons-
America.
The Mormons were more an American
It's still
thing.
an offshoot of
It
Lutheranism,
is, but
because it was an interpretation of the Bible
but
by
Mormonism
a
wasn't.
layperson that can just con people into their belief system.
But Mormonism wasn't specifically right in the midst of that initial Protestant Reformation.
Correct, and you didn't have a lot of weirdly non-Catholic Christian cults appear until many years after the Lutheran Reformation.
Okay,
Because Martin Luther gave the authority of God's word into the common man, that led to a Pandora's box of abuse that can be done by humans, because we're not a great species.
Are you arguing that, okay, this is my interpretation of the argument, that the people are pretty stupid and
He shouldn't have done what he did?
Martin Luther rightfully noticed that the church at that time
still is bullshit.
And corrupt and abusive?
Uh-huh.
At that time. At that time. Catholic Church now.
As a recovering Catholic,
He
certainly
saw something and he said
not
something,
now.
and no one was
Right,
happy
but-
about it.
It falls under the law of unintended consequences. He thought what he was doing was right, because he thought that people would interpret the Bible the way he interpreted the Bible. And then he gave that power to people. There's
Sometimes,
no
Micah, you need
gatekeeping in
to
there.
lance a boil. Sometimes you need to cut off a limb to save the body. Sometimes it really sucks,
But this is lancing. This is cutting off a limb and grafting it to someone else, and acting like that functions too.
I don't know if that's quite the metaphor. But
It's an abomination of what he had occurred, like what
Right.
occurred.
just a homunculus.
What he planned was a good intention. He was going to take away the power of the centralized Roman Catholic Church.
I don't think he
and their
was
power
worried
hierarchy.
about good intentions here. I think his focus was, hey everybody, this is stupid. And here's why. Here's 99 reasons why.
And a bitch ain't
But
one.
a bitch ain't one.
Yes,
And a
sir.
bitch ain't one.
Look, my argument though on this is that do you believe as well of like the one man theory of changing history, right? Because
Oh no, I'm a ways and means,
Ways
not
and
a
means.
great person of history.
And, like,
okay,
what about
Or means
fucking
and trends,
Darwin and
whatever it is.
his theory of evolution and the book he wrote that was super controversial? Still is for some people because they're
Someone
dumb.
else would, because someone else would make the same observations.
Yeah. So what's to say that someone wouldn't have made the same observations as Martin Luther? He just happened to be the guy who did it.
Because he didn't make an observation, he took an active role against a
He-
power establishment. He was a
And
revolutionary.
what part of writing a book that isn't an action? Like that's an action. You're publishing a book of your theories and spreading that information. He put Martin Luther put his 99 problems on the fucking door to the church and said, here's the bullshit I see, and here's the
I
problems.
really want to make a rap song
Same
about
thing.
Martin Luther posting his 93 thesis, but to the music of 99 Problems.
I would be okay with this, as long as it's historically accurate.
But the gray version. Let's get that Beatle remix in there,
Mm.
because what MF Doom did was amazing.
My other question is, if as a ways and means or trends sort of view of history, the Gutenberg press came around that time, right? Like this
Well,
is
it did help with the dissemination
Right.
of it, which
So-
the Protestant Reformation in Germany, I think something in Germany.
Oh
but,
man, I'm gonna have to read up on this shit later.
No, we're not about fact checking.
Later.
But sure, it helped to be disseminated by that. But if somebody else did not take his direct actions and also translating the Bible into the common language. Oh, fuck, was that Gutenberg that translated the Bible into common language? No, it was Luther, wasn't it?
Luther,
No.
but they used the technology that just started to come into fruition, right? Like before, if you're going to write a book, it would be very difficult to get to spread that information like a virus, go viral, right?
Right, because only the rich had books.
Yeah, I mean, it was difficult to copy and to duplicate.
You had to
Fair
hire a
enough.
scribe who was literate, and even then, sometimes they'd make mistakes or weird spelling
letter by
errors.
letter, word by word. But with
Yeah.
the
Also, some weren't literate; they just copied.
That's
what
what
was
I
in front
mean.
of them.
Is so they
And-
mistick a letter or two.
but
And that's where you get the nice, like, Englishman playing the trumpet out of his ass. Because they just would get bored while scribing, so they doodle the thing on the side, and it's so very funny.
and the issue,
But, like, the fact that it wasn't destroying, like, it wasn't taking a power, or how he went about it wasn't taking power away from the establishment. It was
He's an asshole who's just
judoing
complaining.
that power
No,
to
he's-
a different type of abuse.
No, he's just an asshole who's complaining, and he's demanding someone do something about it. And then someone did several people did something about it.
obviously, it's like him lighting, pouring gasoline into a fire, but also setting the fire,
Yeah,
right? Like, but
he
the
struck the match.
but the issue too is that like,
Well, at least he's not claiming the insurance.
didn't he? No, my thought is that, I mean, how the fact that he distributed his book and created this fucking terrible situation of Europe for quite some time meant that the whole geopolitics or at that time of the Vatican and their power over the European states must have been on pin and needles to begin with. Like they did not have a strong handle on the governing power. If one guy with one book was able to really set the world ablaze, at least that portion of the world, with just his thoughts, like that's kind of crazy.
Power to the poor.
I'm thinking like, yes, I agree with you that he's one of the biggest sons
He
of
just
bitches.
gave the excuses. That's
But
all. People
the-
just needed a reason. They were already ready to.
Yeah.
Like they were. Let's be honest. They were ready. They were already like, "What is this bullshit?" And someone had
Humans
the
are
audacity.
pretty good sheep.
They are, but when you
If,
have the
like,
church selling
challenging
no,
status
but you
quo
have
takes a lot.
you have
Right.
you have the church selling indulgences, and you're a peasant, and you're just like, well, okay, that seems kind of bullshit. Only the rich get to be, absolved of their sins. I
But
guess I'll just have to
I
be
am
good.
The poor. It is easier for me to get into heaven than it is for a camel to get into the eye of a needle.
Yeah, but like I'm poor, so I'm suffering and I'm hungry, and I see these fucking rich assholes who are now getting an easy fucking
But the suffering in this
absolvent
life
to
means a
their
more
souls.
glorious
No.
afterlife. So the church tells me.
No,
Well,
I
look.
don't. I'm a very now-centered peasant, so I'm just gonna be like, no, this is fucking bullshit.
Hey, I'm an 1890s
You know, like, I'm
peasant, all right, not a
suffering here.
1390s peasant. I'm looking at the future.
I just want to feed me and my family. That's all I'm looking for. The next fucking bread, okay? Like, fuck these rich people getting their fucking sins absolved for money. They can just throw a coin into the church's coffers and call it good and even. And like, here I am. I have to be like fucking virtuous? No, fuck that noise. But they, they're just grumbling, right? Like, but no,
But also at that time,
Martin
how did you have
Luther,
a peasant understand that some royal's kid paid
I
for his
can't
indulgence?
remember if Martin Luther was kind of like, he wasn't like gentry or anything, I don't think, but I don't think he wasn't like that bad off. Like, he wasn't
Yeah, upper middle
like
class.
he was more
literate,
wealthy. Yeah,
which
he
is
was
big.
literate and he was more wealthy. Like, he had probably more to lose in some ways, but less to lose because his social status was high enough. So like, he's like, hey, this is bullshit. And everyone else who's thinking the same thing but quietly because they're peasants and they don't feel like they have a voice, we're like, oh, okay. Yeah, fuck this. Let's start our own church. Let's start a revolution.
All right. Okay, so
We've got permission now.
I have a hidden topic in here.
All right.
Oh boy.
Because it was a question, and our podcast isn't based on questions. Our podcast is based on definitive facts. My question:
Sure it is.
how do we, or how can we better prepare for unintended consequences? Because the corruption that spawned from the Protestant Reformation gave the authority of God into anyone. Because it was based on anyone's interpretation of the word of the Bible that gave them authority. And that led to abuses we see to this day.
I mean, you're putting a lot of pressure on people who want to further a cause and are impatient about it. You're putting a lot of pressure on, like,
that they have the forethought and see how their ideas can be corrupted.
Well, it's hard because unfortunately we're human and we're not really good predictors of the future. We're really just not. Like, like,
Aren't we? Nostradamus was pretty good.
I'm pretty sure none of his things.
If you take every third word from his odd but divisible by
0% came true.
But
So,
if you put a .com on that, then holy shit, hold on to your hats.
What I'm saying is,
but that leads us to now.
People
like
are
having a website gives you authority.
People are not
Right?
good.
Mhm.
No, people are not good at predicting the future. So, unintended consequences are probably going to happen. You can plan as best you can and hope for the best, but like, no matter what you do, there's going to be consequences. You're not going to make everyone happy, and you're going to end up stepping on some toes.
I think that the biggest issue is unintended consequences in a flashpoint, right? Because the issue with Martin Luther was that he released a document, created a conflagration. We're still fucking dealing with that today.
Yeah, there was gasoline already on the tinder
Right.
pile, and he just lit the match.
And then really, I think from my limited understanding of that time would be, of course, that it was a very political problem. Well, I'll just put it politely like that. And there's another kind of concept of Jesus, what's that guy's name who wrote Common Sense? Was it Thomas Paine? And he kind of wrote this kind of ideology that you shouldn't have taxation without representation, and fuck the guy in England, right? And the weird part about this is that by all accounts, like, that pamphlet was kind of spread between all these pubs. Again, I have a really shitty concept of history here. And it was enough to get the peasants to revolt against the king, right? That's a very strange concept here, because at least in the American side, there weren't Americans or British. The people that were well off were the ones paying the taxes, not the fucking peasants, right? And it was the people that were well off that wanted to stop because they're assholes. They're so rich they didn't want to give any tax-paying dollars to anybody ever. I'm familiar. And they were able to trick the peasantry to be like, hey, fight for us. You're not going to really get anything out of it. In fact, many of you guys are going to starve at Valley Forge, but, fuck that. I'm not. And you're going to fight for the richest behalf against, at that time, a very strong military. And you're going to succeed, maybe? I don't know. okay, the weird thing about this is that the unintended consequence of Thomas Paine writing that was, what was his game? Like, did he really want the colonies to revolt? And even if that was the case, like, did he really think that it was gonna work? I mean, there was like probably a good 5 to 10 years that they didn't think it was gonna like stick. The British still kept their troops in the forts beyond the colonies because they were gonna just take over the colonies when all the leaders of these states are going to squabble and bicker and disintegrate. And then who's
But
going to go and pick them up?
Thomas Hobbes wasn't a lone thinker of
Paine.
that vein. What did I say?
You
Paine,
said
Hobbes?
Hob.
Oh, yeah, because I'm thinking of Leviathan.
Yeah,
Yep.
same concept, but
British and
whatever.
short.
Yeah.
Yep.
But you had a group of like semi-aristocratic Brits that didn't like the monarchical system, and they saw like what's happening in Parliament ends up being more of a representative republic than a true monarchy, because post Charles II, the crown had a lot less power in England.
Right.
So you had 200 years of a bunch of thinkers saying like, maybe we don't need the crown. And looking at these biomes of colonies and being like, England, like America's a long way away, and they have a lot of natural resources. Like, maybe they should be autonomous.
I agree, but the argument is that there's no way he would have known how that coin toss was going to work. Like, I would argue 9 times out of 10, the U.S. should have failed, right? They're a new nation. They're full of jackasses. Everyone is in it for themselves. The colonies don't get along. They're wildly different economic systems. And frankly, it's a miracle that it even got off the ground.
I don't
right?
know if it's that much of a miracle. Yes, in some ways.
If we didn't have the French,
Yeah.
it would not have happened.
It would
Yes,
not-
that's true.
But it's not a miracle that we were able to coerce the French into helping us fight against the British.
No, and it's not a miracle that the British gave up, because the fucking resources they have to send to get from England to the United States at that time was a lot.
Yeah,
The cost
their
was
Pyrrhic
not
victory was
worth
their only victory.
the cost was not immediately worth the potential gain, that they couldn't do it, and there wasn't enough public support to keep funding that.
I mean,
I think the War of 1812 proves that.
Yeah.
I think that again, another war where the U.S. would have. Okay, there were some tactical blunders that the English made, right, or the regulars, that they would call them at the time, that make no fucking sense. Like, so,
Redcoats in New England.
like when they went and they let Washington escape because a bunch of fucking merchant marines or whatever, like they went ahead and like transported a trapped army that Washington led into a trap and got himself stuck. But suddenly he was able to miraculously disappear. Like, there are many stories like this where, like, I'm surprised they fucking won on a military sense, not just on a political sense. If the French weren't there to bail their ass, I'm surprised of that too, right? Like, shortly thereafter, the French failed because, like, not the military, like the French state failed, right? They had their own revolutionary war against the king. So it's like
that was inspired by their actions in our revolution.
it doesn't, like, looking at it from an American perspective, we were always taught as kids, like, oh, this is a surefire thing. But like looking at how nation states are built today, I'm like, holy shit, aren't we so lucky? Right? Like, yeah, it does cost the British a lot of money and troops to send and pacify, but really a ragtag group of like Washington militia against the best military at that time, with no navy, mind you, right? Like, it really boggles my mind that not only was Washington able to secure a military victory by the skin of his teeth.
I
Right.
don't think I mean, it might have been by the skin of his teeth, but I don't think you're giving enough credit to the fact that the people who live here have home advantage in a way. Like, they know the land, they know, like the British soldiers might, like if they're loyal to the crown and they're like actually, living here but still loyal to the crown, that's one thing. But you send more troops over that aren't as familiar with the land, like that's and there's a lot of land. Like, you can,
and it's also
you can,
equivalent military equipment.
like, you can,
Like, the guns from the Redcoats were incredibly similar guns to the rebels.
Like, I
Rebels.
know that there's a lot of, like, skin of the teeth,
Minuteman.
like, things for probably Washington, but, like, you're assuming that there wouldn't be someone else to take his place.
I
And
do agree. I don't think anyone else would have been able to.
I disagree. I think I think people put too much, like, hero worship, I guess, into one individual. Like, yes, that individual did the thing, but I don't think it's like they were the only person who could have done that. I don't think that's true. I think
I
someone else could easily step into that position if that vacancy was left.
I don't. In some cases, like in many of the more modern wars, I will agree, right? But in the Revolutionary War, the very fact that he was running a hit and run campaign for all those years is super demoralizing on the troops, right? Like,
Yeah.
But that was the only means of tactics that benefited what he had available.
Yeah.
He was outnumbered. He was out supported by guns and cannons and whatnot. He couldn't do an open, face-up, knockdown fight with the British.
Had to be
He would
kind
lose
of
every
guerrilla
single time.
warfare.
but
Yeah.
He
keep
had
this
to go guerrilla.
keep this in mind.
But
Like the idea of a Fabian strategy,
War of
in and of itself, is a doomed one, right? Because the guy that the thing is named after was booed. He's like, boo this motherfucking Fabian. Like, we want to actually fight toe to toe. It's super demoralizing to have to resort to hit and run tactics over and over again and not win a fucking fight. Like, this is the reason why people are like, oh, Washington is a great military strategist, not because he actually won victories. Like, he didn't, and he won, again, many of them by the skin of his teeth and through deception, like killing people on Christmas. Yeah, that's not that fun. But he was good because he was able to keep his army intact without mutiny, which there were cases that they were fomenting for sure, right? Like he gained what, like 15 pounds during the winter of Valley Forge, while his men starved to death. So like this guy, I agree with you. Like we do hero worship, but he did pull a rabbit out of his hat. From just the military perspective, if you're looking at it like a Seven Wonders board game, like the fact that he was able to, again, secure an army and still fight while many of the cities were being occupied by the foreign forces, and that he couldn't even buy food supplies because like his money was worthless, right? And so he would go to villages and towns asking for food, and they're
Well,
like,
luckily he had the charisma to keep his army in check.
that's what I'm saying is
I
that if
mean, but that doesn't mean that there isn't someone else who could have filled those shoes.
I'm pretty
if
sure
1776 failed and we were still a colony, 30 years later we would have another revolution.
I would agree.
Another generation, and if we had the same type of overbearing taxation, and if the British were more violent, that would spur a more fervent
okay,
additional revolution.
three things. Disagree, right? First of all, one thing is that if George Washington would have been killed or slain in war, I don't think, if you look at their officer corps at that time, the next guy up was Benedict Arnold. So just heads up there, okay? So the second part is like, yeah, another war. Like, the taxation wasn't outrageous to begin with. The reason why they were being taxed that high was because they started the French Indian War because he was a fucking idiot. And guess who started that? George fucking Washington did, right? Like he was in a group, and he ends up kind of sparking this thing when he wanted to be an officer corps in the British Army. Anyway, moving on, it would be more like we would have the same relationship with the Commonwealth as Australia, New Zealand, Canada does today. I mean, again, the taxation from the American propaganda side or India was more like, oh, we were overtaxed and that's why we want to fight. No, again, the aristocrats of the American side were overtaxed. But again, it was only to cover the cost of the American Indian War that the Americans, again, fucked up. And then the idea is like, well, the British says, okay, why don't you guys
So,
arm yourselves?
I have to disagree. Only because of how our like how we formed as a nation. Because like Australia, for example, like Canada maybe was a little different, but Australia, that was, like people were sent there as exiles. Like they were an island for prisoners or people who were just like, nope, we're gonna get rid of you. Bye. America was a place where people escaped to, like the the hyper religious people who were being shunned out of their crazy cult ways. They were like, well, let's go to the new world because there we can have our paradise and we can live life how we want. And that was their mentality going to America.
From disseminating from the 93 Thesis put up by Martin Luther. Got it back.
Religious persecution.
Full circle. But that's what I'm saying is like the type of people who came over were already stubborn assholes who wanted to live their own fucking lives the way they wanted to in their weird Puritan crazy ways.
Okay.
And they didn't want the fucking anyone else telling them how to live.
Look,
I have a quick caveat. I acquiesce that Washington started a war that England didn't want to pay for. But that's because England didn't know what they had as a continent.
True.
If England knew the size of America, that investment would have been double,
right,
triple from the British side.
At least.
But
so it was their laziness and lack of foresight in what was salvageable out of an unknown territory.
There's a couple things I wanted to say is that Americans' supremacy wasn't guaranteed. It was a fucking gamble. I don't think that anyone would disagree with that. And that's just the military side of it. And I would disagree on the thing that, 30 years later, there'll be another war. It's like, yeah, okay. You're right about that. The issue I have, though, is you're saying that American people are stubborn, right? That's kind of the whole point of the colonies to begin with. They all left Europe, and they're going to say, you know what, fuck you, I'm going to start my own thing with blackjack and hookers. And they go to the U.S.
They just don't like being told what to do.
Now, imagine
Can we not talk about Jersey so much?
No, I'm going to talk about Jersey, because this is important to my point.
All right, fine. Back to blackjack and hookers.
So, back to blackjack and hookers, you have 13 different states essentially operating on their own currencies and their own type of culture. And they're all very stubborn, and they all have very different economic systems. And you expect these people to get along. That's very laughable, right? The fact that you're saying, oh, well, these guys don't want to be told what to do. Let's set up a federal government and tell them what to do. It is beyond nuts that this works.
Yeah, but they had a common enemy.
Did they? I mean, again, though taxation wasn't unreasonable. Again, it's a U.S. colonies that fucked it up to begin with.
I'm just gotta spin a story that
look,
convinces the peasants.
This is crazy.
And how long until the colonies would go against Spain to get Florida?
Again, if they knew what they had, like you're saying, they wouldn't have let it go. I am absolutely convinced of that.
That's true. If they understood.
But the fact is they didn't and didn't have modern communication, fine. I think that Americans are a special kind of stupid that works in our favor. Which is oh yeah, there's a big superpower over there. Let's go get our gun. It's look, you're not going to be able to win a war with just your gun. It's
we're
no, I got a couple of my
dumb that
friends.
even the enemy can't figure out what the fuck we're doing.
It's the whole...
There is an argument to be made of the amount of firearms that were in the hands of the poor and average colonialist at the time.
Again, British...
Because that is something that wasn't in England, because they had very restrictive gun laws that you had to be of a certain class in order to own a gun, because they didn't want their poor to fight back.
There's three things working for American side. The geography, like you mentioned, but also it was a war for England to lose, right? So they decided to say, yeah, go ahead and arm yourselves. We don't want to pay for it anymore. We don't want to send regulars over there to clean up your messes. So that was a big mistake. Mm-hmm. The second one is, again, we're a very special type of stupid, which kind of moves towards World War II, where the German joke of the American forces were, for Russians, they will fight to the end. For the British, they'll follow the rule book. And for Americans, we know what their rule books are, but they never follow it, so we're always surprised.
Yep. We don't know what the fuck we don't know what we're doing, so you have no idea what we're doing. So when we decide to do a thing, it's anyone's fucking game, and we're just happy to be here. We're fucking happy to be here.
So
and that's not true. We're not happy.
No, we're not happy. But I'm not going to sound like an American apologist. I am glad America won the war against the British. I'm surprised that they did. I'm surprised that they created a federal government. They failed the first time with the Constitution Convention. But again, the fact that Thomas Paine wrote that and he's like, "Oh yeah, it's gonna be a sure thing," you betcha. It's like, no, he didn't know that. Like, it could
God, I
have.
didn't know he's Minnesotan.
He's
I know,
Minnesota.
right? I was
Gosh,
thinking
you
the same
betcha.
thing.
These colonists are gonna fight back against the crown.
They
It's
all
just
have Minnesota accents. Okay, colonial
it
time.
is predetermined.
thing.
Let me tell you, it's like my aunt Janice. Just she was definitely gonna leave Jim.
Oofed up. Look,
Oofta.
I honestly believe that he,
I
again,
tell you what.
of the unintended consequences side of it, like, it worked out well for us, but it could have also worked out very poorly. Same thing
But
with
what is that poorly? What would happen if we were still a Commonwealth of the Crown?
we could be like India, where they make us starve to death, or like Ireland, right, where they made them starve to death,
No,
or like
we were an other. We have what we did to the Native Americans is what we did in India. That is not different. That is something that like India and America have in common.
I mean,
Like the Brits and those that they sent here to rule were real shitty to Native people.
honestly, it could have been a war of, like you're saying, of a Fabian strategy for a long, long time, right? Where people are just going to go up in arms and be a militiaman and fight against the government, and you're just going to have terrorism for a very shitty period of time where nobody's
That could
happy.
have. I agree that could have happened. I still think ultimately it would have ended up with American independence, but I'm glad it was not as long and drawn out as it could have been.
It might not even be American, it could have been French, right?
That's true.
Like, if the Americans totally got wiped
Or Spanish.
as they did. Again,
Or Portuguese with their fancy navy.
Not so much the Portuguese.
Why not?
Why
I know,
not?
They didn't have a
they're-
big footprint. In
Yeah, I was
North
gonna say
America.
they don't have enough like
Except for
that
Brazil.
great
Okay.
navy, not as
That's
many
South America.
resources.
Yeah.
Different continent,
They,
and they definitely screwed themselves by drawing that line.
yeah, they could.
Sure, they got half of Brazil, which is big.
The
They
issue
just didn't know the other half of the continent was there, and they gave that to Spain.
at
Well,
that time.
Takes a lot to get out. It takes a lot to get through that rainforest, man. Like that's a lot. All right.
Okay.
Just wait for the,
Like going into
So-
the bush is hard. You don't know what's in there, and like it's just you
And-
might as well just stick
and
to
a
the coast.
small bug will bite you, and you'll die in a week.
Yeah.
My argument, though, is that
Something
if you,
weird.
the worst case that could happen is that the people of the colonists will be launched to, like you said, a different empire, whether it be French or Spanish, right? Like hence the French Indian War. If you have a government that's continuously fighting against freedom fighters or terrorists, right, it weakens the whole financial system. And in order for economics to work, you need to have a stability, sort of like, what tomorrow is going to be like, what next years are going to be like. And you can't have that if you have people running amok with guns, which it could have been the case for a very long time. And then what would happen? You have a very fragile system that has lots of resources. You're free lunch for another nation state to take you out. And that happens at that time. Every type of flavor you could imagine. And it still happens today. So, yeah, it would have
But
been really bad for
America's
the
pretty
colonists.
rich in resources. I don't think we would
But
necessarily
that
run
was
out.
unknown at the time.
Right.
Yes, but
And especially after a brutal civil war where both sides are kind of weak. Like, I could
Yeah,
imagine
and we
another.
still didn't know what this country had to offer in 100 years after the revolution.
I could imagine other countries like like the whole Louisiana Purchase, that was a French territory, right? And like the Quebecois is a French area. Like, if they didn't fuck it up by sponsoring the U.S. war, they would have a really large presence there, and then we would be the lunch for the French at that time if we weren't friends. So it's like, yeah, that would not be a really good time for the colonists then either. So like,
Yeah, you can make the same argument that if you fought against the French after that point, it'd be the same logistics issue. Like, if you had a stabilized former British colony fighting against, like, the French, they would have gone to war, and the French wouldn't have the same supply chain.
okay, the big problem is that the colonies really depended on trade with Europe. And that was set up by purpose by the British. Like, the Americans could not trade with the French or with Spain or any other type of European power. They had to go through certain type of merchant trades with England, like the end, which really stifled the innovation of the U.S. at that time, right? So like, let's fast forward to the American Civil War, because Americans love war, and we decided to have a war against ourselves because every great nation has that, right? Okay. Why the Union had
Yes.
one of the main reasons why the Union won was because of the blockade, right? So the southern states could not trade their very, very valuable resources with Europe because of the blockade stopped them. Well, in the American Revolutionary War, Part 1, they were able to get through the British blockade because, again, the Americans did not have any naval power by using French ships, right? So, like, if you imagine a war with the French and the Americans just got through a shitty civil war that failed, I'm just saying that we would be launched to the next nation state. That wouldn't be a great time for anybody. And then we would say, oh, that Thomas Paine guy, like, what an asshole. He didn't realize the consequences he had. If only he hadn't wrote that book, we would just be way better off. And so that's the problem, is that these type of
Someone else would have done it.
these type of turning points are a huge gamble. They either work out great, like in our case, or they work out really fucking shitty, like in Martin
They
Luther's
work out
case.
great, or we don't think about it or care about it because they didn't work. That's just how it goes.
Right.
They don't work, so we don't remember that person.
Or we remember
They'll
them
write
as...
a book that has something really poignant to say, but no one reads it, so they're like, anyway, moving on.
Like,
and then we never hear about him again.
my argument is that
Okay.
if you're...
You guys rehabilitated Martin Luther in my mind.
Oh, I'm sure he was still a bastard.
I'm
but
sure he was
the
a
fact
bastard,
that,
right.
But unintended consequences is, like, that's either going to happen or it doesn't. It's not.
I would
really...
argue that, yeah, he is a big bastard. I would also say that...
He's a right bastard.
And I'm sorry to say this, but, like, as far as concepts go, the one that's even more poisonous than... Is the Catholic Church the baddies? Like, the one that's worse than that?
Are we the baddies?
is,
There are a lot of skulls in Catholic iconography.
I would say the one...
Yes, you are the baddies. You fucking are the baddies. Just accept it.
Yeah, I don't know how to answer that. Is it the fact that, like, the people, in order to stop people from doing stupid shit that are naturally stupid people, which we all
don't
are.
give them the choice. You're right. We should lobotomize every human on the planet.
No,
Yep, that Phil. No, that's genius.
No, I want to hear what Phil says, and then we can be done.
well, fine. So the problem we have is that too radical of changes is a really shitty time for most people. That's the problem. It's fine to have progression in reasonable stages, but, like, having a quick change is a recipe for, wow, that guy Martin Luther is a fucking asshole, or hey, who wrote that, like, manifesto? That guy's a fucking asshole. Like, anything that's a quick change, that sucks. Like the guy who, like, burned himself in a fruit stand in the Middle East, like, that was a quick change, right? And we're still dealing with those consequences today. And those things are the things that really make everyone very fearful, because that's when unintended consequences occur, is when you can't...
May you live
in interesting times.
times.
The way that you mitigate this is that you have, like a safety release valves, right? So it's not a pressure cooker, because you know that the change is coming. And the way you have that is that you have a sizable part of the population which are completely centrist. Like in Futurama, telling my wife I say hello before they all die, right? Like, just neutral people that don't care about politics. They only just care about barbecues. And that makes society move slow. But then you have a chance to be able to mitigate the harmful changes of too fast of pace. And the problem with our current environment is that everyone hates those fuckers. Because if you're not with us, you're against us, right?
Yep.
But we really...
they want change, and they're impatient for it because,
right.
Well, they're suffering now. And they're like, well, if I'm suffering, the rest of you should be suffering too until I get my way.
And that's the extreme signs, and we're becoming more like that. But in reality, we need those centrist motherfuckers that everyone hates, and we need them there because they're the ones that are the balancing act. And again, maybe I'm saying this hypothetically, but if we had a group of centrists during the American Revolutionary War, we wouldn't have been in a war, because too many of the centrists would be like, yeah, I don't know, man. Like, I just don't want to deal with that, man. And then that would be it. You know, we would be a British colony, and we would be at the subject of the whims of starvation, like they treated the Indian and the Irish. then that wouldn't be very good. So I'm not arguing that like you can't have quick sudden changes and it's not like a great thing, but it's risk reward. That's all I can say.
The ultimate, I mean, ultimately we end up hopefully in a better place than what we left, but in the meantime, with those unintended consequences from those quick changes, yeah, it really sucks to be living through that. Yeah. All right. Well, good question.
Thanks, Mom.
Yeah. Good topic, Micah. Thanks, Mom.
Thanks, Mom.